Minecraft is not a game. It's a video game. But not all video games are games. They're a combination of 3 different things that may or may not include being a game. Now, of course, this just depends on how I'm defining what a game is. But that's actually not an easy thing to do. One of the most influential philosophers of all time even called this impossible. And we're going to talk about both why he said that and why I think it's still practical to define games in spite of it. But before we directly talk about that, I want to start with a complaint that I've been holding on to for my entire life.
You check in your rule book, but you won't find anything in there that says a dog can't play.
He's right! Ain't no rule said the dog can't play basketball.
This is a crazy thing to say, right? Like, even if we accept the whole dogs playing basketball thing, America is a common law country. So that means we're setting precedent for other decisions to be made in the future. Suddenly people think they're justified in strapping blades to the feet of chimpanzees and giving them sticks to hit children with.
Wait a minute, it's a monkey!
Of course, some games will have rules that prevent too big of abuses. Boxing should be alright with the addition of some new weight classes, and at a high level, lots of sports have rules that require blood work to be done to prevent doping, which is going to prevent a lot of non-humans from legally competing. So maybe we'd be alright. But the precedent being set here is not animals are allowed to play sports. It's anything not explicitly banned by the rules is allowed in a game. And this opens up way more possibilities than just fluffy critters on the field. Is your defense not cutting it in rugby? Start building defensive fortifications. Your opponent in chess keeps making moves you're not predicting? Just start gluing their pieces to the board and you can restrict their viable options. Falling behind in a game of League of Legends? Call your cousin who works at the server bank and start ripping out wires. Hey, I don't know, there was nothing that said you couldn't do that. What I'm getting at is that games always have some sense of what's fair and what's not, beyond the written rules. All games have an infinite number of ways to cheat that aren't necessarily stated. And assuming you agree with this statement, I have a follow-up question. How do you cheat at Minecraft? Normally, you would say cheating is something like being invincible or having infinite access to resources when you normally wouldn't. But in Minecraft, that's just called creative mode. I would hardly call a setting you can enable at the beginning of a game cheating. Maybe instead you hack into the game and modify the core functionality. That's normally cheating. But again, that's just playing modded Minecraft. There's nothing that makes that an unfair thing to do. There is no way to cheat because anything you could do to try to cheat is an equally valid way to play. And that's because Minecraft is not a game. It's a thing you play games in. Those games can be cheated at, but Minecraft in and of itself cannot. If you want to ask questions like what makes games fun, what's the difference between a good and bad video game movie adaptation, or how can we use games to make learning more enjoyable, this distinction between a game and a thing you play games in becomes very important. So what is a game then? First of all, a game needs an objective. Let's say we're trying to get from block A to block B. This is pretty easy on its own. So we can then add rules that restrict the methods you can use to accomplish that goal. Say we build a path and say you have to use that path to get from A to B. Now there's a series of games we can create just on that one rule. If the path has a lot of jumps that are kind of complicated, we've made a parkour game. If it's a maze, it's now a puzzle. And if we add a bunch of monsters you have to fight while remaining on the path, it's a combat challenge. The combination of a goal with rules that restrict how you can accomplish that goal is what make these games. But whether or not they're fun games depends on how difficult that rule is. If we just make a straight path between A and B, then it's trivially easy. It's not fun to just hold the W key and win. And on the flip side, we can also add restrictions so much that it's impossible to accomplish the goal. And this is also not fun, because there's no point in even trying. There's a theory in psychology called the flow state, which is this idea that your brain is optimally engaged when it's challenged enough to not be bored, but not challenged so much that it's overwhelmed. And within games, we can see that people modify rules to achieve this. When a game is too hard, you can remove rules to make it more fun. Take bumper bowling, where you remove the normal bowling rule of gutter balls to make it more fun for kids. And when a game is too easy, you can add more rules to keep it interesting. There's lots of people who grew up playing Pokemon and really enjoyed it, but now find it too easy to be enjoyable as adults. So there's a number of fan-made rules you can add to Pokemon to make it more challenging and therefore fun for a more advanced player. And you can really do this with anything. Adding extra rules to make for an interesting challenge is a whole genre of channels here on YouTube, whether that be for traditional games like video games or board games, or adding rules to make things that are traditionally not games into games, something like an interesting challenge for movie making. All of these are people who are in the spirit of playing a game, adjusting the rules in order to make a fun game. This is the essence of what philosopher Bernard Sweets would call having a Lusory attitude, which is the final component necessary for something to be a game. And if you'll bear with me, I think this is best explained with a brief tangent about American history. This song, America the Beautiful, is written about the view from the mountain Pikes Peak. Pikes Peak isn't the tallest mountain in the US, but it's taller than anything around it, and so the views from the top of it are pretty incredible. Unfortunately, Pikes Peak's a real pain to get to. To get there from the closest town, you have to take the Bar Trail, which is 11.5 miles, or 18.5 kilometers if you use a reasonable measurement system in your country. And that's not 11.5 miles of easy terrain either. It's a pretty difficult hike, and the entire time you're in a low oxygen environment. This is the part in the script where I'm supposed to have like a Tom Scott style talk to the camera a bit, but I am way too asthmatic to do that right now. Sorry, picking up recording from home, it was the case that the only way to get to Pikes Peak was via the Bar Trail. But at some point, that changed. Because around the same time that song was written, in the 1890s, something new came to the mountain. They built a train that takes you all the way from the nearest town to the top of the summit without ever having to do any exhausting climbing. It's complete with a cafe at the top and a conductor that makes bad jokes on the way up.
Rocks are very precious to us here in Pikes Peak region, so please, don't take it for granted.
But despite having the option of every luxury you could ask for, people still do the difficult hike. They've even carved out a more steep section to make a harder version of the same hike. The hikers at Pikes Peak have an objective. They're trying to get to the top of the mountain. And they have rules. They're following the path and trying to get there in a certain amount of time. Hikers are playing the game of hiking. So just because there's a more efficient way to achieve their original goal of getting to the top, they're not going to do it because they have an attitude of wanting to hike. When you're playing a game, you're not just trying to achieve an objective. You're intentionally trying to achieve an objective in a certain way in order to have fun doing it. The entire point of you playing this parkour map in Minecraft is to have to jump over these obstacles. So if you do something that subverts your need to jump over the obstacles, you're not playing the game anymore. Or at least you're playing a different game. So in addition to needing an objective and rules to play a game, you also need this Lusory attitude. An attitude that says you're playing this game in order to play it. You don't really care about the objective at the end of the day. And this is what gives rise to those unwritten rules we talked about every game having. You don't need an infinite amount of rules because anything that sabotages the core thing you're trying to do is going to be cheating, even if it's not explicitly banned and might get to the objective more efficiently. So that's what a game is. And hopefully that definition makes my initial statement of Minecraft is not a game a little more clear. But I'm sure some of you are already thinking, and have maybe already commented, a valid critique to this, which is, what gives you the right to define what a game is? Like, there's plenty of situations of people calling something a game that doesn't fit this. For example, the academic field that is the study of games is called ludology, which is called that despite the fact that no one has ever heard of that word before, because mathematicians had already taken the term game theory, wherein they define game as a totally different thing than what I'm talking about here. Even if we're just talking about Minecraft, people are going to use the term game differently. Like, literally, if you want to download the app, you go to the website and click on the section titled Games. So obviously, Microsoft has a different concept of what a game is than I do if they're including Minecraft. The famous philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein even goes as far as saying that it's impossible to define what a game is. You can have a sense of what it means, but it's going to be different in every context in which you'd use it, so you can't have a single definition that always works. So why am I sitting here trying to give a single definition of what a game is, when one of the most famous philosophers of all time is saying that that's an impossible thing to do? So first of all, I want to note that he doesn't actually say this about the word games, he says this about the word Spiel, because he's writing all this in German. And I realize this is the third video in a row I'm referencing that translations don't perfectly convey meaning, but I think it is still important to reiterate. And in addition to that, I think it's also important to emphasize that Wittgenstein was a philosopher. He wasn't a linguist who studied how language works, and he wasn't a game developer, as much as that existed at the time he was alive. He's not someone who really cares all that much about games. He's using this as an example of words having more contextual meaning than we talk about. So in different contexts, what a game means can be a different thing. And he's making this point because a number of very famous philosophers, say Plato for example, spend a lot of time trying to define things. Plato tries to do things like define what justice is, where he'll break down a single definition and then apply that to different scenarios. But what Wittgenstein is saying is you can't do that. What a word means is dependent on the context. Game means a different thing if you're talking about board games versus ball games versus gambling games. So justice will mean a different thing in a different context. You can't define it first and then apply it to the thing later. You have to look at each individual scenario and figure out what justice means in that case. And this actually lines up really well with a debate in linguistics, which is prescriptivism versus descriptivism, where prescriptivism prescribes rules for how language is supposed to work, whereas descriptivism tries to look at the way language is being used and then formulate rules based on that. So, for example, it has to be the prime minister. They are the only one who can start the meeting. A prescriptivist might look at this and say, this is ungrammatical, and you should instead say, it has to be the prime minister, he or she is the only one who can start the meeting. A prescriptivist will have rules they define ahead of time. In this case, that they is the third person plural pronoun, and so can't grammatically be used in this context. As opposed to a descriptivist who will say, people use they as a singular pronoun all the time. And because people use it like that, it's a valid way to use it like that. And pretty much every formal linguist thinks like this, because when you think about language, it's intersubjective, by which I mean no one person defines how language works. Like, I can invent a word florp and say it means something like a weirdly shaped car, but if no one else knows what I mean when I say florp, that's not really language. On the flip side, even if no one else agrees with us, if me and you agree what florp means, then we're successfully communicating and using language when I say, look at that florp over there. No individual one of us can define the rules, but as a collective, we can between us determine how language works. But having this attitude of language works however language is used makes it a lot harder to formulate models for this kind of stuff. Like, it's really simple to say that they is only the third person plural pronoun, while it's a little more complicated to say it could also be a singular pronoun. But it's actually more complicated than that, because it's not just a singular pronoun, it acts like a plural pronoun. The thing being referenced is the prime minister. The prime minister is the only one to do it, but we don't say they is the only one who can do it. We say they are the only one who can do it. The verb still acts like it's plural. So to correctly model this, we have to say there's some distinction between plurality in semantics versus plurality in syntax. And as with everything, this is going to get more complicated as you add more languages to integrate into this model. Take Arabic, where instead of just having a singular and plural pronoun, there's also dual pronouns, where there are exactly two people. So even just looking at two languages, we already have a pretty complicated set of rules to describe plurality. So if we want to have some descriptive model that could describe any possible language, we'd eventually get to this unrecognizable mass of a million rules and a million exceptions. So descriptivism, describing language as it's actually used, is certainly more accurate to what's actually happening, but it's a lot more complicated than just positing a definition. And so while this might anger all the linguistics professors who taught me in college, I think there is value to just using the simpler model in a practical situation. And that's what I'm doing with the word game. By saying Minecraft is not a game, what I'm really saying is Minecraft is not a game for my definition of what a game is, which is kind of generic enough to mean anything. Like I could just as easily say Minecraft is torture for certain definitions of what torture means. But what I'm going to argue for is that it's not just an arbitrary definition, it's a useful one. Being prescriptivist allows you to posit a definition that you think is practical. And I genuinely think this way of thinking about what a game is helpful for designing and analyzing games. Like in a previous video, I made this model of how empires rise and fall. I would argue, by my definition, this is not a game. There's no objective and there's not really any rules. You can just kind of spin around a globe and watch it run by itself. But if I want to make it a game, the definition gives me a framework to build off right away. I need to add a goal. Maybe you want to make an empire of a certain size. And then I need rules that constrain how you do that. So you can't just arrive at that goal automatically. You need to have some ways you can influence it and build towards it. And that needs to be somewhat difficult in some manner. At least for the type of creative person I am, that's a really helpful direction to start with. So maybe I should title this video, Minecraft is not a game, asterisk, for certain definitions of games that are practical in this use case. I'm being honest, I don't think that's quite as snappy, but what do I know? So we have a definition for what a game is, and we have the justification for why we're using that definition, but there's still a pretty obvious unanswered question. If Minecraft's not a game, what is Minecraft? In the beginning of this video, I said that Minecraft is a video game, but video games aren't necessarily games. And in a normal understanding of English, that's a little weird. You would expect video to be describing the type of game it is, given its position in the sentence. But I'm positing that video game here is a compound word, like greenhouse. A video game is not a game, in the same way a greenhouse is not a house. But despite that, a house can have a greenhouse in it, and in a similar vein, a video game can have a game in it. So I'm going to posit that video games have three main components. And this is one of those necessary but not sufficient to be a video game type things. Those three components being a game, a simulation, and a story. Most video games have a mix of all three of these elements, but I think you can be a video game by having only one. So my software from the last video, which we already mentioned is not a game, I would still call a video game under this category of simulations. Like, it has interactive 3D graphics, there's some mechanics of things going on, and it's made in a game engine. Other video games that would purely fall in this category would be things like Universe Sandbox or BeamNG Drive. There's no inherent game to them, and there's definitely not a story, but you can buy them on Steam. I think it's reasonable to call these video games. Then, to fully switch to the story category, I think you can also comfortably call visual novels video games. And some people might disagree with this, but Steins Gate is a visual novel. It's basically just a picture book that you press a button to advance the pages in. There's no mechanics that would make me call this a simulation at all. There's no real game that you're trying to play. And despite all that, I was able to walk into a normal electronics shop in Japan, go to the video game section, buy a Switch cartridge of this, and play it on my Nintendo device. So at least I'm comfortable calling this a video game. And then finally, some video games are just a game without anything really being simulated and without any real story. I think rhythm games fit this really well. There's a goal and some rules, and you just have to do it or fail. And then more abstract puzzle games also fit this well. You have one objective that is told to you, and you just have to solve it. So those are the outer edges of this model, and then most video games will fill in with some combination of all three. And the utility of this model is we can look at how each of these axes affect one another. So for how games affect stories, we already talked about how the Lusory attitude makes you ignore certain things when playing a game. The hikers were playing the game of hiking, so didn't care about another method of getting to the top of the mountain. Similarly, someone playing a shooting game is not going to care about other ways to resolve a conflict. which can be really good if you want to do a story about violence. Like, I don't think I would have liked Hotline Miami's serial killer extreme violence vibe in a normal story, but in a fun action game, I was totally okay with it. But you have to watch out, because if the game doesn't align with your story, then the thing that people will be ignoring is your story. This happened to me playing Haste, a video game all about going as fast as you can and maintaining momentum as you navigate tricky terrain. When the story had the main character get depressed and listless, I just didn't care. I didn't want to pause and contemplate what was going on and empathize. I just wanted to speed through everything and keep going with the fun movement. So here, the game sabotaged my interest in the story, which in the jargon is called ludonarrative dissonance. Stories and simulations also have interesting interactions. Like, for example, knowing that a simulation exists can encourage you to try to explore the possibilities within it. So Mass Effect simulates some level of character choices instead of just being a static story. And these character choices are set up within a simulation that gives you good or evil points. The knowledge that an evil path exists will encourage players to try that out, even if they normally wouldn't be interested in a story with an evil protagonist. This is taken to extremes with so-called sandbox games, which have a ton of this simulated complexity, and don't have a game that they tell you to play at all. It's up to you to figure out the game you're playing on your own. It can sometimes be hard to figure out fun things to do, but that's where story can come in to help. Take Universe Sandbox, a astrophysics simulation with no inherent story or game. There's cool things you can do with this, like smashing planets together, but it's up to you to come up with them. Compare that to Kerbal Space Program, which is also about astrophysics, but has this narrative of building a space agency and exploring the universe. So the story encourages all these goals that you should have. You should try to orbit around the planet and get to the moon and then land on other planets. Kerbal Space Program is a deep enough simulation you could do a lot of other stuff in this software, but the narrative encourages you to do space exploration. Games like The Sims, RimWorld, or Crusader Kings take this a step further because part of what the simulation is simulating is characters and storylines. When in the simulation, some guy kills my brother, it encourages me to have the goal of getting revenge. These story elements can help imply a goal for you to accomplish, and then the simulation provides both the means to do it and the rules you have to follow in order to accomplish it. And importantly, whether it's a simulation or not is not a binary statement. It's a spectrum, where the further we move along this simulation axis, the more mechanics and complexity we add. And those mechanics and complexity give more options within games. Hotline Miami is not much of a simulation, so when police show up, you have to kill them. All that there is to do is accomplish the game of shooting the things. But in Grand Theft Auto, which has a lot more simulated elements, you have some options of what you can do. You could get in a shootout with the police, or you could try to hide from them, or you could get in a big car chase. It's simulating a whole city, so you can use that whole city to accomplish the goals in the game. Damn! And then finally, we have interactions between the simulation and the game. In a similar way to how games make you care more or less about aspects of a story, they can make you care more or less about different mechanics of a simulation. If certain mechanics are helpful for the game you're playing, you're going to engage with them a lot more, whereas if they're not very helpful, you're going to ignore them. So, for example, a lot of RPGs have a crafting system that I generally totally ignore unless the combat gets hard enough that I feel like I can't win without it. And as a designer, this can really suck. If players find a valid strategy to beat the game, they're going to ignore all the mechanics you spent a lot of time building. Soren Johnson, one of the lead designers on a number of Civilization games, called this players optimizing the fun out of the game. So a well-designed video game will have a game within it that encourages you to utilize all the mechanics that they've built in their simulation. A good example of this is Chicory. Chicory is a video game about painting, and while the main quests use painting and a lot of Zelda-style puzzles, the side quests intentionally have very little game to them. There's rarely any objectives beyond the vague make a painting, and they don't use rules to restrain how you're allowed to paint things. There's, to some extent, a game in make a painting using a limited toolset instead of something like Photoshop, but Chicory never sets hard targets, like draw a painting with 25% of it covered in blue. And that's because when you set up a game like that, players will just try to win the game. So they'll just smear some blue on the page and call it done. Whereas if you say, make a painting, literally anything's fine, then people will tend to be more self-expressive. There's nothing they're trying to optimize for, it's just whatever you want to do. The developer of Chicory did a really good talk about this at the Game Development Conference, which I encourage you to check out. And there's also a cool guy in the Q&A section who was at the time struggling with some social anxiety. So we try to cut him a bit of slack. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts for how do you encourage creative problem solving, where you want people to solve problems, but in creative ways, or if maybe that's kind of doesn't quite fit in this framework.
It's a really interesting question.
Now, past Greg gives a nice answer to my question there, but I've spent the last 2.5 years working on this model in order to answer it in a way I find satisfying. So let's do that. I'm going to define creative problem solving here as coming up with a clever, original solution that's unexpected in some manner. And I think strictly the only thing you need to be able to do this is a deep enough simulation. You need a sufficiently big possibility space for things you can do in order to have some of those be unexpected. But as we mentioned, when playing a game, players will tend to find the simplest solution they can and then stick with that. It doesn't matter if it's tedious or not fun, players will tend to do it if it's effective. So we need our game to have a difficult enough objective or rules to eliminate all the easy solutions. But as we mentioned, if you make a game too hard, it's not going to be enjoyable for people. So ideally what you have is you have a base game that is somewhat easy and manageable, but then you use your story or mechanical depth to encourage players to take on challenges that seem nearly impossible, requiring them to use creative problem solving to figure them out. I think great examples of this are things like pacifist runs in RPGs or extreme constraints in engineering games. These aren't things you should expect every player to do, but well-crafted simulations and stories can imply that it's a thing you could try. And a deep enough simulation can provide unexpected solutions to what feel like impossible challenges. And overcoming difficult challenges like this that seem impossible at first is, in my opinion, one of the best experiences you can have when playing a game.
Doomed, detected, and
So hopefully that helps show why I think this is a useful framework for analysis. And while this is something that I just made on my own, I think it has a lot of connections to other people's theories of how games work. For example, I think it pairs really nicely with how the Magic the Gathering team talks about player archetypes. They've come up with 3 main archetypical players, or mindsets that players can have, and they line up really well with game, simulation, and story. The first archetype is Spike, who is the player who cares about winning above anything else. They'll find the most optimal strategy and use it as much as they can. In video games, these kind of players will follow the metagame super closely and don't care about engaging with mechanics or story. Next player archetype is Johnny, who is a player who doesn't care as much about playing optimally, but wants to play in interesting ways. Johnny's like finding some weird gimmick card and building a whole deck around that. And I think this lines up well in our framework of players who care much more about the simulation than anything else. They're fine not winning as often if they can do something interesting with the mechanics and engage with the simulation in a fun way. Like when I played Overwatch, I never cared if Lucio was a meta pick. I liked playing him because I thought his wall riding ability was really fun to use. Then the final archetype is Timmy, who doesn't care about winning optimally or doing some interesting mechanical thing, but just wants these big, cool-looking creatures to show up and smash his opponent. And I think you can map this to people who prioritize story above the other 2 aspects. I don't care that adding mech legs to my battleship is inefficient, I want to do it because it's cool. I don't care that Shadowheart always misses her spells, I want her in my party because I think she has a cool story. All this to say, while I think it matters how these things are designed in video games, there's a level at which the player's mindset is also crucial for what part they're getting. And it's important for designers to keep in mind that there are different players who are going to want different aspects of a video game in this way. So like I've said from the beginning, Minecraft is not a game in an arbitrary, but I think useful way. Thinking of video games as a combination of a game, a story, and a simulation helps us analyze them in a way that I think brings to light some of the more complicated interplay within them, and shines a light on how different players can view a video game differently. Now, I didn't make up this definition of what a game is. This is more or less directly taken from Bernard Sweet's amazing book, The Grasshopper. I think it's genuinely my favorite book. It manages to be a philosophy book that's also really funny and has a lot of implications for making games, which is what I do for a job. I also only know about this book because of a footnote in a different book that I like, and that's part of the inspiration for why I like to directly reference other things you can go to read in these videos. The Grasshopper also has a whole section about the implication for this definition of games on society. A game is a thing you do in order to do it, not because you're trying to achieve some end. And in a world of generative AI, I think this idea is increasingly relevant. It's important to see the value in doing the hard thing just because you're doing it, even if there was some alternative method you could use to do it more efficiently. To a large extent, I'm making these videos because I want to make them. I'm not doing this for my job. But despite that, there's things I'm paying for, like that train ride up the mountain wasn't free. And support for that kind of thing is brought to you by viewers like you on Patreon. You can tell I watched a lot of PBS as a kid, but anyways, I'm gonna go back to doing other difficult things for the sake of doing them, and I hope you can continue doing the same.
玄米いつ頃